I'm now ready to begin the painting itself. I've done all my preparation, done my drawings, line drawing and a value study. I have my colours pre-mixed here. I have my panel tinted with the burnt umber acrylic. I've kept it to fairly warm background because there's a lot of very cool blues in the painting. I've taken it a little bit darker than I might usually because the predominant value of the piece is quite dark. So this will help with the flow of the paint. So I have the panel, 8x10 panel, covered in ground, ready to go. I have put a little bit of my linseed oil and Sansador mix on it just to help the paint flow a little more easily. Not too much, otherwise it becomes, we end up swimming through the canvas. So just a little bit. And now I'm ready to do the drawing. I'm going to use the darkest mix for this, which is the ultramarine and alizarin crimson mixed together. So I'll do the drawing, and I'm also going to set in the darkest values at the same time, like I did with that value study earlier, the one in marker. It's important to remember this is just a guideline. It's like scaffolding for your painting, just so we know roughly where we are on the canvas. We don't want the lines to be too heavy, otherwise we're going to be fighting with them later on in the painting. Now, before I go any further, there's one thing I need to be really, really careful of with this painting. I'm going to get another panel to illustrate this principle. So I have a lot of orange lights which need to be really, really clean in this. I'll show you what happens if they're not. So if I have some of this purple mix, which is ultramarine and alizarin, I then introduce some orange into it. What happens straight away is it dulls it down to something quite mucky. So when I'm then trying to lift up into the lights, the light paint really struggles to stand out against this really dark mix underneath. So what I need to do instead is to leave a little barrier around certain areas. So for instance, the lamppost, the light coming off the lamppost, if I went in with a light yellow, it immediately dulls it right down. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to, for instance, bring some dark paint up, leave a gap, get my bright saturated paint into the central section so that it's nice and clean, and then just work with the transition in between very gently. So you can see the difference quite clearly, how intense that orange is there, which means I can build up with a yellow And it's nice and clean. There's no purple contaminating it at all. Okay. So if I go back to this painting, the boat is fine. This is all really dark in value, so I can cover that with the dark paint. And I used purple for the darks instead of a black substitute, which is brown and ultramarine. It's just a nicer, cleaner colour, but it's similar in value, so it gives us the same effect. So denser paint in the areas that are darker, and then as the paint wears out of the brush, just scumble it across the top to create a slight difference in value there. So the mountain in the distance, this is where I do need to be careful. So I'm going to block in a certain amount of this. I'm going to leave a gap for the lamppost. Look for where the good solid masses are and just leave an area there to get the lights in with a little barrier around them. Over here we have dark just on the very tip. We have dark at the bottom near the water, and a lot of the lights are occupying a portion about 2/3 of the way up that little bit of land there. But from a distance we get a sense of the overall value. Now I'm going to go on ahead and block in the sky. So for this I mixed ultramarine with a little bit of white just to make sure I had the right value, and I put a little bit of red into it to pull it towards the purple, what we call a very cool blue. Again, whoops, I need to make sure I leave that area where the lamppost is nice and clean. So I want to leave that area just there. So it's a process of sort of blocking in, and then we're going to gradually fill in some of those gaps. What it'll leave us with is beautiful, clean, saturated colours. Let's bring that down. And the water is pretty much the same value, reflecting that sky above it. Okay, down on into the quayside, and we'd mixed up a similar value, but we pushed it more towards the purple. Okay, now it's not a perfect colour. Had I used maybe a magenta paint, I would have been able to get a slightly more intense purpley pink. But it's a paint I know not many of you will have. Incidentally, saying that, it's probably a good idea to have a good range of paints. You might not use all of them all the time. You might concentrate on a core set of colours like I do, but it's often a really good idea to have, you know, half a dozen or a dozen other colours that you can introduce into your palette. I'm going to get rid of that, not get rid of that brush, set that brush to one side, and I'm going to go in for some of the orange colours now. For this I want a good, clean, fresh brush, okay? So the idea being that this brush will do anything from the red, possibly pink, into orange, into yellow, fairly cleanly. Once the blue comes into it, it brings it down into greens and browns, and that's where things start to get a bit mucky. So I'm going to pick up some orange. I'm going to introduce a little bit of orange into that halo around the street lamp. I can bring it down into the lamppost. I can bring some of those lights over here. Into the distance. And then we also have some of this fairly deep orange on the rock. We also have some on the key side. Careful again to leave a barrier between the orange and the purple, which we'll fill up later on. Possibly a little bit of it coming over here. I'm now going to lift up into a lighter orange and look for where this becomes more intense. So what we're doing is traveling along the spectrum a little bit, from a dark red up into a brighter orange, up into a lighter orange again, up into yellow, right up into the whites. So anywhere else we've got light oranges? Yes. There's some quite strong colours on that small little section of upturned boat. Do you notice how the lamp comes up to a brighter orange? And try and create a halo where the darker red stays on the outside and it comes into the lighter orange in the middle section. Now they're really starting to stand out. Let's go a couple of stages further, maybe up into a yellow orange, so a tiny bit of orange into a yellow. And you'll see it really start to lift up now. Not everywhere. I think the key side stays in the orange. The upturned boat certainly takes on some of the yellow tint, as does that little section there. And it's probably a good place to stop now for the block-in. One last thing possibly. Should we look at these two signs here? One of them is certainly in the blue end of the spectrum. This one here. It's a little lighter than the water, so let's take maybe our purple, add a little white to it, and there we go, put that one in. And then the next one is, I would say, more towards the pink. So with the same brush I can get a little bit of red, add some white to it, okay, and probably a good place to stop for that first video.